The multiverse is a tapestry of infinite realities, each governed by its own immutable laws. Some realities are built on science, others on myth, and some on the quiet, terrible understanding that monsters are real, and they have been real for a very long time. What happens when the most dangerous human being alive walks into one of those realities without a map, without warning, and without the faintest idea that the man he was sent to kill cannot die from a bullet to the chest? What happens when the High Table's most feared instrument of death steps into a war between immortals during their most volatile, leaderless, and desperate hour? The answer is not clean. It is not fast. But it is inevitable. If you want to see more crossover battles and unexpected universe collisions, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and universe you'd want to see in the comments below. Let's explore the infinite together. The Budapest in November smelled like coal smoke and cold river water. The Danube moved black and slow beneath the chain bridge, and the old city pressed itself against both banks in layers of stone and soot and centuries of quiet violence. It was the kind of city that knew how to keep secrets. The architecture itself seemed designed for concealment. Arched courtyards swallowed sound, basement staircases descended further than any basement had reason to go, and the streets in the old Buda districts narrowed until two people could not walk side by side without touching. John Wick arrived on a Tuesday, which was as good a day as any to kill someone. He came through Vienna by train, a single leather bag in the overhead rack above him, a dark wool overcoat across his lap, and the particular stillness of a man who had learned long ago that the best way to disappear in public was to give people nothing to look at. No fidgeting, no phone, and no eye contact that lingered past the casual. He sat by the window and watched the Austrian countryside give way to the Slovak border and then flatten into the Hungarian plain. And he thought about the contract the way a carpenter thinks about a difficult joint. Not with anxiety, but with the methodical attention of someone who has done hard things before and expects to do them correctly. The target's name, according to the dossier delivered through the usual channels, was Vidor Kezman, Hungarian national. Listed occupation, private security consulting. The dossier noted he operated out of a commercial district in Pest, maintained a secondary residence in the Buda Hills, and ran what appeared to be a sophisticated network of Eastern European organized crime with tentacles into police departments, municipal contracts, and border control. The High Table wanted him removed. The reason, as was often the case with High Table contracts, was not provided. The fee was substantial enough that Wick had not asked. What the dossier did not mention, could not have mentioned, because whoever compiled it either did not know or had been paid to omit it, was that Vidor Kezman was 163 years old, that his skin had not seen natural sunlight since the reign of Franz Joseph I, and that the network he ran was not organized crime in any human sense of the word. It was a Lycan pack, restructured, modernized, and operating behind layers of corporate infrastructure and human intermediaries. But at its core, a pack of apex predators in human skin, reorganizing itself in the political vacuum left by Lucian's death and the collapse of the old order. Wick did not know any of this when he checked into the continental Budapest under a work name, hung his coat on the back of the door, field stripped his Glock 34 on the hotel desk, and went over the contract one final time. The continental Budapest occupied a converted Habsburg-era building near the Andrassy Boulevard. Its lobby decorated in dark wood and leather, its staff trained to the same precise standards of discretion that governed every continental property in the world. The manager, a narrow-faced man named Domonkos, greeted Wick personally at check-in, a professional courtesy extended to guests of Wick's standing, and held the eye contact approximately 2 seconds longer than necessary. Wick noticed. He filed it away and said nothing. He spent the first afternoon conducting surveillance. Kesman's primary operation ran out of a converted warehouse in the 9th District, the kind of industrial block that had been gentrifying slowly for 20 years without ever quite getting there. Surrounded by auto body shops and wholesale textile warehouses that kept irregular hours. Wick walked the perimeter twice on foot, once in the late afternoon posing as a lost tourist consulting his phone, and then once after dark in different clothing. He counted entry points. He noted the guard rotation, 4 men visible, cycling in pairs, heavily built and moving with the particular fluid economy of people who trained seriously. He noted the camera positions. He noted that the guards did not breathe vapor in the cold air the way they should have. He noted it and moved on, because there were explanations for such things, and none of them occurred to him yet. He made entry at 11:47 p.m. through a service corridor on the building's east side, past a single guard he rendered unconscious with a controlled application of force to the carotid. Standard, clean, no noise. Inside, the warehouse opened into a vast interior space that had been subdivided into offices and operational areas, industrial lighting casting everything in harsh white. There were more guards than the exterior had suggested. Wick moved through them with a terrible efficiency that had made his name a whispered thing in every criminal organization on 4 continents. Close quarters, economical, each engagement lasting seconds and ending with someone on the floor. He found Kesman in a back office, put 2 rounds through the man's chest at a range of 12 feet, center mass, watched him fall, confirmed the shot placement, and turned to leave. Vidor Kesman stood back up, not stumbling, not gasping, and he rose from the floor with the smooth, unhurried motion of a man getting out of bed on a slow morning, looked down at the 2 holes in his shirt with an expression of mild irritation, and turned his eyes on John Wick. They were not the right color. They caught the overhead light in a way that eyes did not catch light. Wick shot him 3 more times, twice in the chest, once in the head. Kesman's head snapped back. He steadied himself against the desk, when the wound at his temple was already closing. The room went very quiet, except for the ringing in Wick's ears and the low, inhuman sound building in Kesman's chest. Not a growl exactly, but something beneath language that registered in the human nervous system as a very old and very serious warning. Wick did not panic. He assessed. 5 rounds, no effect. Target is not dying from center mass or cranial shots. The guards outside moved differently than humans. The eyes were wrong. Oh, the wound is closing in real time. He had walked into something the dossier had not prepared him for. He threw a flash grenade, stepped through the window behind him, and ran. He ran the way he did everything else, with purpose and without waste. 3 blocks east, cutting through the narrow service alley behind a row of closed restaurants. Wick pulled up against a stone wall and ran the calculation. The flash grenade had bought him 30 seconds of disorientation for whatever was in that office. Maybe less. He had heard the pursuit begin before he cleared the window. Not the sound of men shouting and boots on concrete, but something lower, and something that moved faster than the light from the warehouse door could follow. Shadows peeling away from the building's exterior with a velocity that made his chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. He had been running for 4 minutes. Nothing had caught him yet. That told him something. Either they were choosing not to catch him, or they were hurting him. Neither option was comfortable. He ducked into a recessed doorway and went still, controlled his breathing down to nothing. Listened. Budapest at midnight had its own acoustic signature, distant trams, the river, the low hum of a city that never fully slept. He filtered all of it out and listened for what didn't belong. 30 seconds passed. A minute. The alley remained empty. The shadows did not move. He came out of the doorway and walked, not ran, back toward the Continental. Walking was invisible. Running was a man with a problem. In his room, he laid out what he knew on the desk beside his field-stripped Glock, the way another man might lay out paperwork. 5 rounds, standard 9mm hollow point, center mass and cranial placement. No terminal effect. Target's wounds closed within seconds. Not the closing of a man running on adrenaline who doesn't know he's dying, but actual, visible biological repair. The guards outside had moved at speeds inconsistent with human musculature. None of them breathed visible vapor in 4-degree air. He thought about the stories. Every culture had them. He had spent enough time in enough dark places with enough people who operated outside the boundaries of normal human experience that he had long since stopped categorizing certain things as impossible. Impossible was a word for people who hadn't seen enough yet. He needed different ammunition. He was reaching for his phone to contact his armorer when someone knocked on his door with 3 precise knocks. Not the housekeeping pattern, not the service knock. Deliberate, spaced, the knock of someone who wanted to be recognized as a professional before the door opened. He took the Glock to the door. Who? Someone who watched you shoot Kesman 5 times tonight. A woman's voice, accented. Eastern European, but smoothed by decades of travel. Calm in the register of someone for whom calm was a permanent condition rather than an effort. You're still alive, which means you're either very fast or very lucky. I'd like to determine which before his people finish their search grid. Wick opened the door on the chain. She was standing in the corridor alone, hands visible, wearing a long dark coat over tactical clothing. Her eyes caught the light from the hallway the same wrong way Kesman's had. She was watching him with an expression that was not quite human in its stillness. Not threatening, simply old in a way that didn't match her face. "Vampire," he said. It was not a question. Something shifted in her expression. Mild surprise, quickly contained. "You adapt quickly. What do you want?" "To talk, and to suggest you take the chain off the door, because the 2 death dealers I have positioned at the stairwell exits are the only reason Kesman's scouts haven't already found this floor. That protection has a time limit." He studied her for 3 seconds. Then he took the chain off the door. Her name, she told him, was Sonia. Not the Sonia from the old histories. She clarified without being asked. Simply a name common enough among coven-born women of a certain era. She had been a death dealer for 90 years, trained under the old Victor protocols, and she was currently operating outside official coven sanction, which in the current political climate meant she was hunted by the same fractured proxy council that was nominally running the European covens in the power vacuum following Marcus's destruction. She sat in the chair by the window and spoke with the measured economy of someone who had learned to say exactly what was necessary and nothing more. Wick stood. He did not offer her anything, and she did not ask. The structure of what she described assembled itself in his mind the way operational intelligence always did. Not as a story, but as a map. Vampires. Lycans. A centuries-long war that had been running beneath the surface of human civilization. A political collapse following the deaths of the elders that had left both species fractured and dangerous in the way that things were most dangerous when their hierarchies failed. Kesman was not simply a Lycan crime lord. He was the closest thing the European packs currently had to a unified alpha. And he was using the chaos of the post-Elder period to consolidate territory and resources at a pace that the diminished covens could not counter militarily. The High Table contracted you to kill him, Sonia said. It was not a question either. Wick said nothing. The high table knows about us, she continued. They have known for some time. Your dossier was incomplete deliberately. Domonkos, your continental manager, has been providing our proxy council with the names and arrival times of high table assets operating in Budapest for the past 8 months. In exchange for protection. In exchange for feeding us useful tools. She looked at him steadily. You were meant to hit Kaisman, fail, and be captured. The council intended to use you as leverage against the high table, a demonstration that the covens' reach extends into their operations. The silence in the room changed texture. Domonkos, Wick said. Yes. He thought about the 2-second eye contact to check in, the professional courtesy that had lasted slightly too long. What do you want from me? He said. Kaisman is expanding too quickly. He will destabilize the covert infrastructure that keeps both our species hidden from the human world if he isn't stopped. The Proxy Council is too compromised and too fractured to stop him. I have 11 death dealers. He has 60 Lycans and growing. She paused. You came here to kill him. I'm telling you how to actually do it. I don't have the right ammunition. No, she agreed. You don't. Idza, but I know where you can get it. Wick looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the contract. He thought about Domonkos and the Continental with its chain compromised. He thought about 5 rounds and a man who stood back up. Tell me about the ammunition, he said. The Death Dealer cache was located in the basement of a private art restoration workshop in the 2nd District, 12 minutes from the Continental by foot, tucked beneath a building that had been quietly owned by coven interests since 1887. Sonia moved through the city the way water moved through stone, finding the gaps, avoiding the surfaces, never quite where the eye expected her to be. Wick matched her pace without difficulty and said nothing for the entire walk, which she seemed to appreciate. The workshop above was exactly what it claimed to be. Canvases in various states of repair, the smell of linseed oil and turpentine, restoration equipment arranged with the obsessive precision of genuine craftspeople. The woman behind the front desk did not look up when Sonia led Wick through a door marked Private, and down 2 flights of stairs into a space that smelled of gun oil, silver, and something chemical and sharp that Wick couldn't immediately identify. The cache was serious. Wick moved along the racks with the focused attention of a man who understood weapons the way musicians understood instruments, not cataloging, but feeling the quality and purpose of each piece. Modified Berettas, Heckler and Koch variants, compact submachine guns with non-standard magazine configurations, ammunition in sealed cases marked with symbols he didn't recognize alongside notations in Hungarian and what appeared to be Latin. He picked up a round from an open case, examined it in the light. Silver nitrate suspension in a hollow point cavity. Sonia said from behind him. Standard Lycan rounds. On contact, the silver disperses into the bloodstream, interrupts the transformation mechanism, and prevents cellular regeneration. Against a standard Lycan, 2 center mass shots will drop them. They won't get back up. Against Kaisman, he's an alpha, older. The regeneration is faster, and the silver tolerance is higher than standard pack members. She moved to a separate case, opened it. These are different. Concentrated silver nitrate. The cavity is pressurized. The dispersal on impact is systemic rather than local. Even an alpha can't regenerate through full system silver saturation quickly enough to remain a threat. Wick picked up one of the pressurized rounds, checked the casing integrity, set it back down, near UV. Sonia indicated a separate rack of modified magazine configurations. Ultraviolet charged rounds for vampire targets, liquid UV suspension. On impact, the charge releases and causes the same effect as prolonged sunlight exposure, accelerated. Against a standard vampire, 1 round center mass. Against older vampires, coven leadership, you would need multiple hits in quick succession before the healing outpaces the UV saturation. And against you. She met his eyes without flinching. Against me the same. I'm not asking you to trust me because I'm immune. I'm asking you to work with me because our objectives align temporarily. He respected the honesty of that. He began selecting ammunition with the methodical efficiency of a man restocking for a known engagement. Loading modified magazines with the pressurized silver rounds, familiarizing himself with the weight distribution. Different from standard loads. Slightly heavier. He dry-cycled a modified Glock 17 that had been adapted for the larger casing diameter, checked the feed reliability, set it aside, and picked up a second. The Proxy Council, he said while he worked. How many? 3 acting elders by self-appointment. None of them have the authority or the age to justify the title. But authority in a vacuum goes to whoever claims it loudest. They operate from a fortress in the Buda Hills, an estate that has been coven property for 2 centuries, modernized sufficiently to function as a command center. Roughly 40 vampires in residence, another 30 death dealers, who have sworn to the council rather than to the old protocols. And they want me as leverage against the high table. They want to demonstrate that they can reach into high table operations, that they represent a power that demands acknowledgement rather than concealment. If they deliver a high table assassin, especially one of your particular reputation, and yes, your name is known even in our world, Mr. Wick, it sends a message to the table that the supernatural community will not be contracted against without consequence. Wick loaded the last magazine and set it on the steel table beside him. He looked at the array of weapons he had selected. 2 modified Glocks, a compact H&K submachine gun with a 40-round magazine of pressurized silver rounds, a tactical knife with a silver-edged blade. He thought about what he was preparing for, and he had spent his career killing the most dangerous humans alive. He was now preparing to kill things that were not human and operated by a different set of biological rules. The math was not in his favor on paper. It never had been, and he had never found that particularly relevant. The Proxy Council made a deal with Domonkos, he said, which means the continental Budapest is no longer neutral ground. Correct. Which means I can't operate from there and I can't use their resources. Also correct. Which means I need a base of operations that isn't compromised. He looked at her. You have somewhere. I have a safehouse in the 3rd district. 11 death dealers who answer to the old protocols rather than the council's convenience. Limited resources, but clean lines. She paused. I should tell you something else. The Proxy Council has already contacted the high table. They've informed them that you are operating outside your contract parameters and that you attempted to negotiate independently with Lycan interests. It is fabricated, but it is the kind of fabrication that requires you to complete the contract and return with evidence before the table will hear your counter. The room was very quiet for a moment. So the table thinks I've gone rogue. As of approximately 4 hours ago, yes. He absorbed this with the stillness of a man filing a very serious piece of information in the correct mental folder. The council had moved faster than he had expected. They had not simply set a trap. They had cut off his institutional backing, isolated him from the one organization whose reach might have given him leverage, and done it cleanly enough that correction required completion of the original contract rather than simply communication. It was, he had to admit, well executed. The Kesman first, he said, then the council. Sonia studied him. You understand that, even with the correct ammunition, Kezman will be surrounded by his pack. 60 Lycans in close quarters, some of them capable of transformation. I've been in worse rooms. She considered this, and something in her ancient, careful expression suggested that she almost believed him. "There's one more thing," she said. She moved to a locked case at the far end of the rack, opened it with a key from her coat. Inside, nestled in foam cutouts, were 4 cylindrical grenades with a distinctive blue-tinted casing. UV fragmentation, developed by our tech division before the Council purged anyone with loyalty to the old guard. The dispersal radius is 8 meters. Against a group of vampires, one device clears a room. Against Lycans, the UV component is less effective, but the fragmentation itself is lethal if the silver content in the casing reaches the bloodstream. Wick picked one up, turned it over, and set it back. He took all 4. The safehouse in the 3rd district was a narrow 4-story building wedged between a pharmacy and a closed print shop on a street that saw almost no foot traffic after 9 in the evening. From the outside, it was indistinguishable from the dozen other residential buildings on the block. Curtained windows, a buzzer panel with handwritten names, a front door with a standard lock that was not standard at all. Inside, the ground floor had been converted into an operational space with the spare functionality of people who had learned through centuries of conflict that comfort was a liability. Cots along one wall, a weapons bench, a table with maps and surveillance photographs. 11 death dealers who looked at John Wick with the particular assessment of very old, very capable fighters encountering something they hadn't seen before. They were fast. He could see it in the way they held themselves, the coiled, effortless readiness of bodies that operated at a permanently elevated physical baseline. The youngest looking among them, a woman who might have appeared 25 to a casual observer, was watching him with eyes that carried the flat, measuring quality of someone who had been fighting since before his country existed. He met each set of eyes briefly and directly and said nothing. He found the weapons bench, set down his selections from the cache, and began a systematic function check of each weapon in sequence. After a moment, the room returned to its own business. That was enough of an acknowledgement as he was going to get, and it was sufficient. Sonia spread a map on the central table. Detailed, hand-annotated, the kind of operational document that got updated continuously rather than printed once. She walked him through Kezman's known patterns. The warehouse in the 9th district was a processing hub. Finance, communications, coordination. The actual pack gathered at a secondary location, a decommissioned rail maintenance facility in the outer districts, 3 kilometers from the nearest residential area. Large interior space, multiple entry and exit points, underground sections that connected to the older tunnel networks beneath the city, which the packs had been using for movement and concealment since the 19th century. "He'll have moved the pack after last night," one of the death dealers said. His name was Balint. Older than he looked by at least a century, built like a man who had spent those centuries doing physical work. He spoke English with a precision that suggested it was his 4th or 5th language, learned when it became operationally necessary. Standard protocol after a security breach. He won't stay at the rail facility. "Where does he go?" Wick said. "There are 3 fallback positions we know of." Balint indicated points on the map. Showed the tunnel network hub beneath the old market district. A converted bunker system in the hills, originally built by the Soviet military in the 50s, acquired by Lycan interests in the 90s. Or he pulls back entirely, consolidates at one of the outer pack territories, and waits. "He won't pull back," Sonia said. "Kezman is consolidating, not defending." Retreating to outer territory contradicts the operational posture he's been building for 2 years. He'll want to project strength. The bunker system. Wick looked at the map. The bunker was marked in the Buda Hills, accessible by 2 roads and 1 track that wasn't on any civilian map. Isolated, defensible, underground sections with multiple internal chambers. He thought about 60 Lycans in an enclosed space with limited sight lines and asked himself the question he always asked in these situations. Not whether it was possible, but where the angles were. "I need the tunnel schematics, if you have them," he said. "Waits, and I need to know transformation trigger times. How fast from human to full shift?" Balint answered without hesitation. "Standard pack members, 4 to 6 seconds under controlled conditions. Under combat stress, faster, 2 to 3. An alpha like Kesman can shift in under a second if he's already elevated. Full transformation means you're dealing with a body mass roughly 3 times human, speed that exceeds what you can track visually at close range, and a pain tolerance that makes standard trauma responses irrelevant. So don't let them shift. Ideally. Shoot them before they start. If they start, shoot them more." He looked at the pressurized silver rounds loaded in the Glock magazines on the bench. 2 center mass stops a standard pack member. "If the rounds are good and the placement is clean," Balint said. There was no challenge in it. Simply the qualification of someone who had learned precision mattered. "As the rounds are good," Wick said, "the placement will be clean." The death dealer studied him for a moment with those centuries-deep eyes. Then he nodded once and went back to the map. They spent 3 hours on planning. Wick worked the way he had always worked, building the operational picture in layers, identifying the variables he could control and the ones he couldn't, finding the sequence of actions that reduced the uncontrollable variables to their smallest possible number. The Sonya's death dealers contributed genuine intelligence. Pack movement patterns, known guard positions, the internal layout of the bunker system drawn from a death dealer who had conducted reconnaissance 8 months prior. He asked precise questions and received precise answers, and when the picture was complete enough to act on, he stopped planning and started preparing. He spent an hour with the weapons, not cleaning them, they were already clean, but handling them, cycling through the mechanics until the modified feed geometry of the silver rounds was as familiar to his hands as standard ammunition. Different weight, slightly different recoil signature due to the pressurized cavity. He dry-fired until the adjustment was automatic rather than conscious. He loaded magazines, checked seating, loaded more. He field-stripped and reassembled the H&K submachine gun 4 times until the modified components moved under his fingers without thought. A Balint watched him work through this process and said, eventually, "You do this before every operation? Before ones that matter? How many operations have mattered?" Wick set the reassembled H&K down and considered the question with more genuine attention than it might have seemed to deserve. "Enough." Balint was quiet for a moment. The pack will not expect a human. They have never been seriously threatened by a human in 400 years of recorded conflict. Means that is either your greatest advantage or the reason you die in that bunker. Wick picked up the H&K and ran the bolt one final time. "Then I won't die in the bunker." He said it the way he said most things, without performance, without emphasis, a simple operational fact. And the room heard it that way. And the death dealers looked at each other with expressions that were not quite belief, but were no longer dismissal either. There was one more thing to address before the bunker. The one piece of unfinished business that sat in the back of his operational mind with the quiet insistence of a problem that would complicate everything else if left unresolved. Domonkos, the Budapest continental manager, had burned neutral ground. He had fed Wick's arrival to the proxy council, fabricated a report to the high table, and structured a trap that had cost Wick his institutional backing and his operational base in a single move. In the world Wick operated in, there were very few absolute rules. But the neutrality of continental ground was one of them, and men who violated that rule did not get to continue managing continental properties. He looked at Sonia. "I need 2 hours before the bunker." She read his face and understood immediately. "Domonkos?" "Yes." "The council will know the moment he goes silent." "Good," Wick said. "Let them know I'm coming." Domonkos lived in the kind of apartment that money decorated, but taste had never touched. High ceilings, expensive furniture arranged without feeling. Art on the walls chosen for value rather than meaning. It occupied the top floor of a converted palace building on Andrassy Boulevard, 4 blocks from the Continental, close enough that on quiet nights he could probably hear the hotel's clock tower mark the hours. Wick thought about that while he worked the lock on the service entrance, the particular arrogance of a man who had betrayed the institution that employed him and then continued sleeping 4 blocks away from it. The lock gave in 11 seconds. He moved up the service stairs without sound. Domonkos was awake, which suggested the council had already warned him. He was sitting in the main room with 2 men Wick made immediately, as coven security, not death dealers. Not trained in the old protocols, but vampires nonetheless, faster and stronger than anything human, and positioned with the professional awareness of people paid to keep their employer breathing. One by the window, one near the hallway entrance. Domonkos himself at the desk, a phone in his hand, his narrow face arranged into an expression that was trying for calm and landing somewhere closer to controlled panic. Wick came through the hallway entrance from the service corridor and shot the vampire near the hallway first. 2 UV rounds, center mass, rapid succession, the way Sonia had specified. The effect was immediate and violent, the UV suspension detonating inside the chest cavity and producing a combustion that bore no resemblance to anything a standard round could do. The vampire went down and did not get back up. The one by the window was moving before the first shot finished, uncovering the distance across the room with the blurring speed that Wick had observed from Kesman's guards and had spent the past several hours recalibrating his threat responses to account for. He stepped inside the vampire's reach rather than away from it. Counterintuitive, the kind of movement that the body's self-preservation instinct argued against and that training overrode. Got his left forearm against the inside of the outstretched arm to redirect the momentum, turned his hips, begar, and used the vampire's own velocity to rotate it past him and into the wall. The impact cracked plaster. He was already bringing the Glock up against the back of the skull and fired once. The UV round at contact range produced results that made the room very quiet, very quickly. The whole exchange had taken 4 seconds. Domonkos had not moved from his chair. He was the kind of man, Wick had already assessed, who paid others for the physical portions of difficult situations and found himself badly exposed when that arrangement failed. He set his phone on the desk with the careful deliberateness of someone trying very hard to appear composed. "Mr. Wick," he said, "whatever you've been told. You contacted the proxy council when I checked in," Wick said. He remained standing. He did not lower the weapon. "You gave them my arrival time, my work name, and my contract details. You fabricated a report to the high table indicating I had gone rogue. You structured the check-in greeting to confirm my identity for their surveillance." He paused. "You burned continental ground." Domonkos opened his mouth. "Don't tell me you had reasons," Wick said. "Everyone has reasons." The conversation that followed was brief. Wick was not interested in the architecture of Domonkos's justifications, the council's pressure, the threats against the hotel staff, the years of quiet coercion that had bent a continental manager into a coven asset. He was interested in operational information, and Domonkos, faced with the alternative, provided it with the rapid cooperation of a man whose self-preservation instinct had overwhelmed his other loyalties entirely. The proxy council had convened a full session that evening. All 3 acting elders were present at the Buda Hills estate. The council had received word of Wick's survival and his contact with Sonia's rogue death dealers, and had elevated their security posture. Additional vampires recalled from outer territories. The estate's external perimeter doubled. They had also, Domonkos confirmed, sent a secondary communication to the High Table claiming that Wick had now made contact with hostile coven elements and was operating as a destabilizing agent in European supernatural politics. The table's response was not yet known, but the implication was clear. The window between now and the table dispatching someone to clean up the situation was narrowing. Wick processed this, asked 2 more specific questions about the estate's layout, and received answers that matched Sonia's intelligence closely enough to be credible. He took Domonkos's phone, the operational files on the desk, and the key card for the Continental's secure communications room, which would allow him to send a direct encrypted message to the table, bypassing Domonkos's compromised channels. Not to explain himself, not yet, but to log a formal complaint against the Continental Budapest's management and trigger the institutional review process that would at minimum freeze Domonkos's access to High Table communications. He left Domonkos alive, not out of mercy, out of utility. A dead Continental manager raised immediate questions and closed operational doors. A living, a thoroughly compromised Continental manager who knew that Wick was aware of every move he had made was a man who would spend the next 72 hours sitting very still and making no further communications to anyone. Outside on Andrassy Boulevard, the November air was sharp and clean after the closed rooms of the apartment. Wick walked 2 blocks before he allowed himself to think about what Domonkos had confirmed about the High Table's posture. The council had been thorough, and they had understood that isolating him from institutional backing was as important as any physical threat. Perhaps more so, because it removed the framework within which his actions had legitimacy and reduced him to a rogue element that could be terminated without consequence. It was sophisticated. He gave them that. His phone showed a message from Sonia. 1 word, ready. He sent back 1 word, coming. The bunker was 40 minutes away by the route they had planned. Through the back roads of the Buda Hills where the city thinned into darkness and the old forests pressed close to the asphalt. Somewhere in those hills, 60 Lycans were waiting in a Soviet-era bunker with their Alpha, confident that the perimeter was secure, and that whatever human had stumbled into their world 2 nights ago was either dead, captured, or running. John Wick walked to the car Sonia had left at the designated point, put his weapons on the passenger seat where he could reach them, and drove into the hills. He was not running. The Buda Hills at 2 in the morning were the kind of dark that cities forgot existed. Not the attenuated urban dark softened by light pollution and ambient glow, but genuine darkness. The kind that had weight and texture and pressed against the windshield like something deliberate. The road narrowed from asphalt to gravel to a track that wasn't on any civilian map, exactly as the intelligence had indicated. Bars and the trees on both sides grew close enough that branches scraped the car's roof in a sound like fingernails on stone. Wick killed the headlights 400 meters from the bunker's outer perimeter and rolled the last stretch on momentum and familiarity with the track's contours, which he had memorized from the reconnaissance photographs. He stopped the car in a shallow depression off the track's left side, killed the engine, and then sat in the darkness for 90 seconds, listening to the forest settle around him. Sonia materialized from the tree line to his right without sound. He had been watching for her and still almost missed it. "Perimeter is tighter than expected," she said quietly through the window. "They've added 8 exterior sentries since our last reconnaissance. Positions here, here, here." She indicated points on the small map she carried. 2 of them are transformed. Partial shift. He's staying on the tree line. They'll smell us before they see us. How far out do they scent? In these temperatures, with this wind direction, 40 to 60 meters for a human. For me, they may already know I'm here. Lycan and vampire scent profiles are distinct enough to register. They haven't moved, which means they're waiting to confirm before alerting the interior. Wick looked at the map. The bunker's main entrance was a reinforced steel door, set into a concrete facade that had been built into the hillside and disguised with decades of vegetation growth. 2 secondary access points, a ventilation shaft on the eastern slope, and an emergency exit on the bunker's lower level that connected to the older tunnel network beneath. The interior, based on the Death Dealer's 8-month-old reconnaissance, comprised a main corridor with 6 branching chambers, the largest of which functioned as a gathering space capable of holding the full pack. Ceiling height approximately 4 meters throughout, enough clearance for a transformed Lycan to move, which meant the bunker had been designed or modified with that in mind. 60 Lycans, 2 transformed sentries on the perimeter, 8 additional exterior guards, Kesman and whatever personal security he kept close. Wick's 11 Death Dealer allies were positioned in a loose arc covering the 3 exit points, not to assault the bunker, which Sonia had been clear about, but to prevent mass exodus if the interior went loud. Their job was containment. His job was everything else. He pulled the H&K from the passenger seat and checked it one final time. "The ventilation shaft," he said. Sonia nodded. 12 meters of horizontal crawl space, then a vertical drop of 3 meters into the secondary corridor. On it bypasses the main entrance entirely. The shaft grating is aluminum. Standard tool can remove it in under a minute. Cover the main entrance until I'm in. If the exterior sentries move before I reach the shaft, deal with them quietly. And if it goes loud before you reach Kesman?" He looked at her. "Then it goes loud." He moved through the forest the way he moved through everything, with the patient, a ground-eating efficiency of a man who understood that speed and noise were not the same thing, and that the former without the latter was always preferable. The exterior sentries were positioned in a pattern that had been designed by someone who understood perimeter security, but had designed it for threats approaching from the road. Wick approached from the northeast slope, uphill from the perimeter line, moving through terrain that was steep enough to be uncomfortable, and exactly uncomfortable enough that no one had thought to cover it seriously. He took the first exterior sentry at 30 meters, a Lycan in human form, broad-shouldered, scanning the middle distance with the elevated sensory awareness of a predator that trusted its nose more than its eyes. Wick came from above and behind, used the silver-edged blade rather than a firearm, placed it with the anatomical precision of someone who had studied the relevant biology in the 3 hours between the cache visit and this moment. The silver content in the blade's edge prevented the accelerated healing. The placement was immediately fatal. He lowered the body to the ground without sound and moved on. The second exterior sentry on the northeast approach heard something. Not Wick, but the absence of the first sentry's ambient movement and the silence where there should have been the small, unconscious sounds of a living thing maintaining its position. He turned, and Wick was already there, inside his reach, the blade moving in the tight economical arc that required no backswing and made no noise worth mentioning. 2 down, 6 exterior guards remaining plus the 2 transformed sentries on the tree line. He reached the ventilation shaft without contact, used the tool on the aluminum grating in 53 seconds, and went in. The crawl space smelled of old concrete and machine oil, and beneath that, something organic and dense that he associated now with Lycan habitation. A musk that was almost but not quite animal. The biological signature of things that were human and also were not. He moved through the horizontal section on his elbows with the H and K cradled across his forearms, controlled his breathing to the minimum necessary, and arrived at the vertical drop in under 2 minutes. 3 meters down, or he gripped the shaft's interior edges, lowered himself to arm's length, dropped the remaining distance, and landed in a crouch that absorbed the impact across his whole body rather than his joints. The secondary corridors stretched left and right, concrete walls with overhead lighting on a motion sensor that clicked on when he landed and flooded the space with flat white light. At the far end of the right-hand corridor, 40 meters away, a Lycan guard turned toward the sound of the motion sensor. Wick shot him twice with the pressurized silver rounds before the guard completed the turn. The sound of the H and K in the concrete corridor was tremendous. There was no suppressor, because suppressed subsonic loads were incompatible with the pressurized casing geometry. And he had made the operational calculation that silence until first contact was more valuable than quiet after it. First contact had happened. The bunker knew he was here. He moved forward before the echoes finished. The bunker responded the way a disturbed hive responded. Not with panic, but with the sudden, violent purposefulness of organisms that had been waiting for exactly this kind of alert. He heard them before he saw them. The sound of rapid movement through the branching corridors. Boots on concrete multiplying into a pattern that told him they were funneling toward the secondary corridor from multiple directions simultaneously. Kesman's people were not undisciplined. They had a protocol for interior breach, and they were executing it. Wick moved to the first branching point in the corridor and took the corner with his back to the wall, the H and K up and indexed on the junction. The first Lycan came around the corner at a speed that would have been impossible to track without the preparation he had done. The hours spent recalibrating his threat responses, rebuilding his reaction thresholds around the new speed parameters. He had been in rooms with the fastest human fighters alive. He had adjusted those baselines upward by a factor of 3 and drilled the adjustment until it lived in his nervous system rather than his conscious mind. He fired twice. The Lycan dropped. The second came from behind the first, using the body as partial cover in a way that suggested tactical training rather than pure instinct. And Wick put one round through the gap between the falling body and the corridor wall. Thus a shot that had perhaps a 30-centimeter window and needed to be taken in under a second, and took it cleanly. The third was already mid-shift when it came around the corner. Caught in the 2 to 3 second combat transformation window Balint had described. The body caught between human and Lycan geometries in a way that was genuinely disturbing to observe, and that Wick observed for exactly the fraction of a second necessary to identify the threat and respond to it. He put 3 rounds into the transforming mass, the silver dispersal interrupting the shift mid-process, and stepped over the result without looking at it again. He moved deeper into the bunker. The main corridor connected to the large gathering chamber through a set of double doors that had been retrofitted with industrial steel frames. The original Soviet installation upgraded by people who needed doors that could withstand forces considerably beyond human parameters. Both doors were open. Light spilled through them into the corridor. And from inside the chamber came the sound of a large number of bodies in motion, organizing, and the low vocalization of an alpha directing his pack in a language Wick didn't speak, but whose operational meaning was unmistakable. He pulled one of the UV fragmentation grenades from his jacket. The gathering chamber held, by his rapid count as he came through the doors, Well, somewhere between 35 and 40 Lycans, the others presumably still in the corridor network or at their exterior posts. The chamber was large, 4 meters of ceiling clearance as the intelligence had indicated, lit by overhead industrials that cast everything in the flat white light of a space designed for function rather than comfort. At the far end, elevated on a natural rock shelf that the bunker's construction had incorporated rather than removed, Vidor Kesman stood and looked at John Wick with an expression that had moved past irritation into something that was almost appreciation. He was already beginning to shift. Wick threw the fragmentation grenade to the left third of the chamber, where the highest concentration of pack members had gathered, and was moving right before it left his hand. The detonation produced a blast radius that Sonia had described accurately. 8 meters, fragmentation plus UV suspension dispersal. The combined effect on the gathered Lycans violent and immediate. Not all of them went down. The older ones, the ones with higher silver tolerance, staggered and snarled and kept moving. But the detonation created 3 seconds of disruption, bodies dropping and others recoiling from the UV dispersal. And 3 seconds in a room was an operational eternity for a man who knew how to use them. He used them. He moved through the disrupted chamber the way water moved through a broken dam, finding the path of least resistance at every moment, never stopping, never committing to a position long enough to be surrounded. The H&K cycled through its magazine in controlled pairs, each engagement lasting less than 2 seconds. His movement between targets, following a geometry that kept his back away from the chamber's center and denied the pack the encirclement they were trying to establish. He dropped the empty magazine, loaded a fresh one without breaking stride, kept moving. A Lycan caught him on the left side. It came from his peripheral edge, already mid-shift, one massive arm connecting with his left shoulder and upper body with a force that lifted him off the floor and drove him into the concrete wall hard enough to crack it. The impact was enormous. Not the impact of a human strike that his suit and conditioning could absorb and distribute. Coste, but something in a different category entirely. A force that drove the breath from his body and sent white light across his vision and introduced a sharp, insistent pain along his left side that told him something had cracked. Possibly more than one thing. He hit the wall and came off it. This was the part that no power, no supernatural ability, no immortality could replicate or fully account for. The part where a human being absorbed something that should have ended the engagement and continued the engagement anyway. Not because the pain wasn't real or the damage wasn't real, but because the decision to continue had been made at a level deeper than pain could reach. He came off the wall with the Glock already out. The H&K lost in the impact and put 4 rounds into the shifting Lycan at contact range. It dropped. He took stock in the 2 seconds he had. Left side, 2 ribs at minimum, possibly 3. Breathing hurt in the specific way that indicated the damage was structural rather than muscular. The Glock had 11 rounds remaining in the current magazine. He had 2 additional magazines of pressurized silver on his person and 1 UV fragmentation grenade. The chamber had perhaps 20 Lycans still mobile, some of them now fully transformed, large, fast, filling the available space with a mass and velocity that compressed his operational margins significantly. And at the far end of the chamber, Vidor Kesman completed his transformation. The Alpha, in full shift, was a different order of problem than anything else in the room. Larger than the standard pack members by a significant margin, moving with a speed and deliberateness that the others lacked, but the intelligence in his eyes unchanged and functioning. Not the pure predatory drive of an animal, but the tactical assessment of a century-and-a-half-old fighter who happened to currently be wearing the body of something that could tear a car apart. Kesman looked at John Wick across the chamber. Wick looked back at him. He pulled the last UV fragmentation grenade, threw it into the center of the chamber to create separation between himself and the remaining pack, and then ran the calculation one more time with the numbers he actually had rather than the numbers he would have preferred. Cracked ribs, 1 Glock, 3 magazines, 1 exit behind him and 1 across the chamber that Kesman was currently standing between him and. He had been in worse positions. He moved toward Kesman. Moving toward the Alpha was either the most tactically sound decision in the room or the last decision he would ever make. And the distinction between those two things was going to be determined in the next 30 seconds. The logic was simple and brutal. The pack took their cues from Kesman, not in the conscious, organizational way that human subordinates followed orders, but in the deep, biological way that pack animals oriented around their dominant. If Kesman was engaged, the pack's focus fragmented between their instinct to support the Alpha and their instinct to maintain their own survival. It created hesitation. Hesitation created gaps. Gaps were what John Wick had been living inside his entire career. The second UV fragmentation grenade detonated behind him, and the chamber filled with the screaming disorientation of Lycans caught in the dispersal radius, beyond the silver-laced fragmentation doing its work on the transformed bodies with a brutality that bought him the crossing distance. He covered the chamber floor in a dead sprint, weaving through the chaos of dropped and staggering pack members, the Glock up and firing at anything that moved into his path with the mechanical regularity of a man who had reduced the gap between decision and action to something below conscious thought. Kesman met him 12 feet from the rock shelf. The Alpha moved with a speed that even recalibrated threat responses struggled to fully process. A lunge that covered 6 meters in less than a second, one massive foreleg sweeping in a horizontal arc aimed at Wick's center mass. Wick dropped beneath it, the displaced air from the swing turbulent enough to push against him even in the miss. Went to the floor, rolled, came up inside Kesman's reach before the Alpha could complete the follow-through. At this range, the pressurized silver rounds needed to reach the bloodstream rather than simply impact. He drove the Glock's muzzle against the joint where Kesman's neck met his shoulder and fired twice. The Alpha's reaction was not a drop. It was a roar, a sound that operated below the frequency of language and above the frequency of comfort, filling the concrete chamber and pressing against the chest like a physical force. And then a backhand that caught Wick despite his attempt to pull clear. The impact traveling through his left arm and into his already damaged ribs with a force that dropped him to one knee and sent the Glock spinning across the floor. He was on one knee, unarmed except for the silver-edged blade. With a wounded Alpha and 15 or more pack members in varying states of combat effectiveness between him and every exit. He drew the blade. The silver rounds had done something. Kesman was moving differently. The backhand that had dropped Wick slower than the initial lunge. The right side of his massive frame, carrying a stiffness that hadn't been there before. The silver was in him. Not enough to drop him. Not yet. But the dispersal was working through his system, and the regeneration was fighting it. And that fight was costing the Alpha processing power that would otherwise go into ending this engagement quickly. Wick used the knee-down position to drive up and forward, inside the reach again, on the blade moving in the tight controlled sequence that the close-quarters knife doctrine he had been trained in specified for targets with superior size and strength. Not trying to cause fatal damage in a single stroke. Because the blade wasn't long enough for that against something Kesman's mass, but targeting the joints and tendons and nerve clusters that compromised mobility regardless of regenerative capacity. If you couldn't stop something from healing, you made it heal faster than it could manage while simultaneously fighting. He opened the left knee joint, the right shoulder, found the bundle of nerves along the inner foreleg that the coven's biological files, which Sonia had walked him through during the planning session, identified as the Lycan equivalent of a brachial plexus, the disruption of which caused a temporary cascade failure in fine motor control, even in a transformed alpha. Kesman dropped to his haunches. Not fully down, not finished, but compromised. The right side of his body responding with the delayed, imprecise movement of a system under partial failure. The Alpha's eyes found Wick through the pain and the silver, and they were still intelligent, still assessing. And what they communicated was something Wick recognized from the faces of very dangerous human opponents in the moments when they understood that the engagement was not going the way they had expected. He pressed the advantage without hesitation, because advantages in this room had a lifespan measured in seconds. He retrieved the Glock from the floor in a sliding reach, rolled away from the pack member who had been moving toward him while his attention was on Kesman, shot that pack member twice on the way back to his feet, turned back to Kesman and emptied the remaining rounds in the magazine directly into the Alpha's chest and throat at a range of 4 feet. Every round. Controlled pairs, the rapid, the pressurized cavities detonating their silver payload inside the Alpha's thoracic cavity in a saturation that the regeneration could slow but not reverse quickly enough. Kesman collapsed, not dead. Wick could see the chest moving, the body's extraordinary biology fighting the silver with everything it had. But down and down for long enough. Newer, he changed magazines with hands that were operating on the automatic competence of someone who had trained this motion past the point where pain interfered with execution, even with damaged ribs that made every breath a specific and pointed argument against continued activity. He was aware, distantly, of the chamber's dynamics shifting. The remaining pack members had seen the Alpha drop. The biological reality of that, the dominant down, the challenger standing, was rewriting the room's threat calculus in real time. Some of them were pulling back. Others were frozen in the specific paralysis of subordinates whose organizational center had just been removed. A few, the ones with enough aggression or enough loyalty to override the instinct, were still moving toward him. He dealt with the ones still moving. Then something he had not fully planned for happened, which was that the bunker's exterior situation resolved itself loudly and badly at exactly the wrong moment. The sound of automatic weapons fire from above, the exterior perimeter, Sonia's death dealers engaging the outer guards, rolled through the bunker's ventilation system and concrete walls as a muffled but unmistakable percussion. And with it, through the tunnel entrance on the chamber's far side, 3 figures came through in the controlled entry posture of people who had been waiting for a signal. They were not death dealers. They wore tactical clothing with no insignia, moved with the disciplined precision of professional military or paramilitary training. And the lead figure was already raising a weapon toward the downed Alpha with the purposeful intention of someone who had come specifically for that target. The Black Ops unit, the human government cell that Sonia had mentioned in her initial briefing, the one that had been tracking supernatural activity in Budapest and waiting for an opportunity. They had been monitoring the bunker. They had waited for the interior engagement to compromise the pack's defensive capacity and then moved on their own timeline, toward their own objective. The lead figure looked across the chamber at John Wick, a human being standing in a room full of dropped Lycans with a Glock and a blade and visibly damaged ribs. And the assessment in his eyes cycled through several stages rapidly before arriving at something that was not quite understanding but was adjacent to it. Wick looked back at him. "The Alpha is down," Wick said. "Not dead. Then your window is approximately 4 minutes before the silver clears enough for recovery." The lead figure was quiet for 2 seconds. "Who are you?" "Someone who was here first," Wick said. "We can sort out the rest later. Right now you have 4 minutes." The figure looked at the downed Alpha, looked at the chamber, made a decision that Wick respected for its speed, if nothing else. He then moved toward Kesman with the specialized equipment that suggested they had come prepared for exactly this contingency. From the tunnel entrance behind them, more gunfire. Closer now. And through the chamber's main doors, the sound of the remaining exterior engagement collapsing inward. The Council's reinforcements had arrived. The Council's reinforcements came through the main doors in a wedge formation that someone with genuine tactical training had designed. Not the disorganized surge of a reactive force, but a deliberate entry pattern that covered the chamber's angles and pushed into the space with the controlled aggression of vampires who had been doing this for centuries. Wick counted 12 in the initial entry. Death dealers in full tactical gear, UV-resistant visors, armed with weapons configured for Lycan targets. Behind them, visible through the doors, 3 figures in heavier clothing who moved with the particular, unhurried authority of people accustomed to rooms organizing themselves around their presence. The proxy council had come personally. Wick processed the geometry of the chamber in the fraction of a second he had before the tactical situation fully crystallized. When the Black Ops unit, 6 operators, were positioned around the downed Alpha at the far end, realizing too late that the reinforcements entering the main doors were not allied with them and were not interested in the niceties of jurisdictional distinction. The remaining pack members, perhaps 8 still mobile, were caught between multiple threats and doing what cornered pack animals did. Pulling together around the fallen Alpha with the last coherent instinct available to them. And Wick was standing in the middle of the chamber with 1 full magazine, damaged ribs, and no allies visible. Sonia came through the tunnel entrance 30 seconds later with 4 death dealers and the expression of someone who had fought her way through an exterior engagement and arrived to find the situation had become considerably more complicated in her absence. Their eyes met across the chamber. She took in the proxy council's entry formation, the council members themselves, on the Black Ops unit, the pack remnants, and Wick's position, and he watched her make the same calculation he had just made. The calculation that said the Council's presence here was not support, not reinforcement, but a takeover. They had waited for the bunker engagement to resolve the Lycan problem and had timed their arrival to inherit the outcome. They would neutralize the Black Ops unit, secure the chamber, crew, and then address the 2 remaining complications that their political agenda required removing. Sonia was one complication. Wick was the other. The lead council member stepped through the main doors and surveyed the chamber with the measured satisfaction of someone reviewing a completed transaction. He was old. The kind of old that didn't show in the face, but showed in the way he occupied space. The absolute absence of any physical uncertainty in his movement. The way the death dealers around him oriented slightly toward him, the way compass needles oriented toward north. He wore a dark coat over clothing that was expensive in the understated way that very old money was expensive. And he looked at John Wick with the expression of a man examining something that had been useful and was now surplus. "Mr. Wick," he said. His English was precise and accented with something older than any modern European language. "You have been remarkably productive. The pack is broken, the Alpha is down, and you have done it with..." He glanced around the chamber with something almost like admiration. "Extraordinary economy. The high table trains its instruments well." "I'm not an instrument," Wick said. "Everyone is an instrument of something," the council member said pleasantly. "The question is merely who holds the handle." He looked across the chamber toward Sonia. "Sonia, you've been a persistent inconvenience." "Victor said the same thing," Sonia replied. "He's dead." The council member smiled with the portion of his face that handled the mechanical requirements of the expression. "Deal with the humans. he said to the death dealers beside him, indicating the Black Ops unit. Then clean the chamber. Wick moved before the order finished. Not toward the council, toward the rock shelf at the chamber's far end. The elevated position that Kesman had used as a command point and that represented the only piece of high ground in the room. He went up the shelf in 2 steps, used the height to put the chamber's layout below him, and shot the nearest council death dealer twice with UV rounds before the formation had fully processed that he was moving. The death dealer went down. The formation turned toward him, and Wick was already behind the natural rock outcropping at the shelf's rear edge, using the stone as cover, the Glock up and working the angles. The rock shelf changed everything. From the floor, the chamber's geometry favored numbers and speed. From elevation, with a rock outcropping that blocked approaches from 2 sides, it became a problem of angles. And angles were something John Wick understood at a level that bypassed conscious thought entirely. He had been fighting from unfavorable positions his entire career. A defensible elevated position, even a small one, was almost luxury. Sonya moved the moment his fire drew the council formation's attention. Her 4 death dealers hit the formation's left flank with the coordinated aggression of people who had trained together for decades, UV weapons firing, blades out for the close work. The chamber became a 3-way collision. Council forces, Sonya's loyalists, Trav, and the Black Ops unit, which had made the rapid and correct decision to use the chaos to fight their way toward the tunnel exit, rather than hold their position around the downed Alpha. Wick covered Sonya's flank from the shelf, identifying council death dealers moving to encircle her position and removing them before the encirclement completed. He was precise about the ammunition expenditure. Each round a decision, not a reaction. The magazine a finite resource that had to last through whatever the next several minutes required. His ribs argued with every movement, every firing position, every shift of weight. He noted the argument and continued. The council member who had spoken was not fighting. He was moving toward the tunnel exit with 2 personal guards. Not fleeing, Wick assessed, but repositioning, extracting himself from the tactical chaos to a position where he could direct rather than participate. Old vampires who had survived centuries did so partly by knowing exactly when a room was no longer the right place to be. Wick dropped off the shelf. The 2 personal guards were fast, council-level fast, which was faster than the death dealers, the acceleration of very old blood. The first one reached him before he fully landed, and he absorbed the impact rather than avoiding it. Let the guard's momentum carry them both into the wall. Use the wall as a third point to create the leverage that his own strength alone couldn't generate against something this fast, and put 2 UV rounds into the guard's abdomen at contact range. The second guard he met at an angle, inside its reach, the blade finding the throat with the clinical accuracy of someone who had located the relevant anatomy in advance and was simply executing a pre-made decision. The council member had reached the tunnel entrance. Wick followed him through it. The tunnel beyond the chamber was narrower, older, the Soviet construction giving way to stonework that predated it by centuries. The original tunnel network beneath Budapest, maintained by the supernatural community since before the city above had been a city. The council member was moving fast, the 2 remaining personal guards flanking him, the tunnel's confines forcing single-file movement that stripped the guards of their ability to cover multiple angles simultaneously. Wick came through the tunnel on them with everything he had left. The first guard went down to the last rounds in his current magazine. He dropped the Glock, empty, drew the blade, took the second guard in close quarters that the tunnel's width made inevitable. And that suited him considerably better than it suited something relying on speed over technique. The blade work in the narrow stone tunnel was some of the ugliest and most effective 30 seconds of his career, operating on damaged ribs, in poor light, against something that healed faster than it should. Ugly and effective, and sufficient. He came out of it with the blade and the council member and 12 feet of ancient stone tunnel between them. The council member stopped, turned, looked at John Wick, at the state of him, the damage, the absolute unbroken forward momentum of a man who had been through the entire night and was still moving. And for the first time, the mechanical smile was absent from his face entirely. You are, he said slowly. Genuinely remarkable. Where is the high-table communication you sent? Wick said. His breathing was controlled despite the ribs. The fabricated report, the documentation. Destroyed. No, it isn't, Wick said. Old vampires don't destroy leverage. They archive it. A pause. The council member looked at him with the reassessing expression of someone recalibrating an estimate significantly upward. The estate, he said finally. Encrypted server. Second sublevel. Wick closed the 12 feet. He came out of the tunnel into the cold November air 40 minutes before dawn. The hillside above the bunker's emergency exit was quiet in the way that places were quiet after violence had moved through them, not peaceful, but emptied. The ambient tension of the engagement dissipated into the dark, and the trees standing around it without comment. Sonia was already outside, her coat torn along the left shoulder, a wound on her forearm closing with the visible, slightly wrong speed of accelerated healing. 2 of her death dealers were with her. The other 2 had not come out of the chamber. She looked at Wick, at the state of him, at the blade in his hand and the absence of the Glock, and the way he was holding his left side with the controlled rigidity of someone managing structural damage through conscious postural adjustment. The council member, she said, dealt with. The other 2 also dealt with. She was quiet for a moment. In the east, imperceptibly, the darkness was beginning to consider the possibility of becoming something else. We have perhaps 90 minutes before the estate's security realizes the council isn't returning. After that, the vampires who swore to them will either scatter or consolidate under new leadership, and the window to access the server closes. Then we have 90 minutes, Wick said. The estate in the Buda Hills was everything the intelligence had described and everything that 2 centuries of coven wealth and paranoia could produce. A sprawling property behind stone walls, security systems that blended modern technology with older, less explicable deterrents. Staffed by 30 vampires who had sworn to the proxy council and who were, as of approximately 40 minutes ago, operating without the leadership they had sworn to. When the Black Ops unit had gone to ground after the bunker, they had their own extraction protocols and their own objectives, and Wick had no intelligence on their current position, which he noted as a variable he could not control and filed accordingly. He and Sonia went over the estate's layout in the car on the way up the hill. She knew it, had operated against it during the early period of the council's consolidation, when before the odds had become unfavorable enough that direct action required reconsideration. The second sublevel was accessible through the estate's east wing, past the primary security station, down 2 levels of reinforced stairwell. The encrypted server was in a room that had been a wine cellar in the estate's previous life, and had been converted with the thoroughness of people who understood that the information stored there was worth more than comfort. And they went in through the east wall at 4:17 a.m. What followed was the most damaged John Wick had been while still operational in a career that had produced considerable competition for that distinction. 3 cracked ribs, a deep laceration along his right forearm from the tunnel engagement that had soaked through the makeshift dressing he had applied in the car. The accumulated impact fatigue of a night that had begun with a target who wouldn't die and had progressed through a Lycan bunker and a council extraction and a tunnel fight. Each of which had asked something of his body that his body had provided and logged against a running total that was now very high. He moved through it the way he moved through everything, with the grinding, absolute refusal to stop. That was not bravado and was not performance, but was simply the deepest operational truth about John Wick. The thing that had made his name what it was and made the people who knew that name treat it with the specific reverence reserved for forces of nature rather than human beings. The estate's security responded. Of course it did. 30 vampires with their leadership gone and their perimeter breached defaulted to the protocols they had been trained to. Interior lockdown, consolidation around key assets, aggressive response to confirmed intrusion. Wick and Sonia's 2 remaining death dealers moved through the response with the complementary efficiency of people who had spent the last 12 hours learning exactly how the other operated. Doc, Sonia's speed and strength handled the engagements where those qualities were decisive. Wick handled the angles, the geometry, the sequencing, the tactical architecture that turned a 3-person entry into something that functioned like a much larger force, because it was never where the defense expected it to be. He acquired a fresh weapon from the 2nd security station. A modified Beretta configured for UV rounds, a full magazine and 2 spares, and felt the familiar weight of a loaded firearm in a working hand as something almost like relief. The 2nd sublevel was cold and smelled of old stone and server cooling systems, the hum of the hardware filling the low space with a constant white noise that was almost meditative. The server room door was reinforced, the lock biometric, the kind of security that assumed the people trying to get in would be working from outside the estate's security perimeter, rather than through it. Sonia handled the biometric requirement with the pragmatic efficiency of someone who had learned that the fastest way past a biometric lock was to bring the relevant biology. The server was running. The encrypted files were present. Wick connected the data extraction device that the Black Ops unit had, somewhat to his surprise, not left with Sonia before their extraction from the bunker. A transaction that had apparently occurred in the chaos of the chamber and that he had not witnessed, conducted on the mutual understanding that the files on this server were of interest to multiple parties for reasons that were not entirely aligned, but were compatible enough for a single exchange. The extraction ran for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Mikar, he stood in the server room with the Beretta and watched the door and thought about nothing except the door. When the extraction completed, he removed the device, and they left the way they had come in, through the east wall, into the gray pre-dawn light of a Budapest morning that was beginning to suggest the sun with the tentative quality of a November dawn that wasn't entirely committed to the project. In the car, driving back down the hill, and Sonia said, "The files contain the fabricated communications to the high table, the documentation of Domonkos's arrangement, the council's operational records going back 18 months. She paused. It also contains records of high table assets that the council identified and tracked over the past 2 years. Names, movements, operational details. Another pause. The high table will want this very badly. Yes, Wick said. And you intend to use it to clean your record with them. I intend to deliver the contract completion and the documentation and let the table draw its own conclusions. She was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, Budapest materialized from the dark in layers, the hills giving way to the outer districts, the outer districts giving way to the city proper, and the stone and the river and the bridges and the first gray light catching the Danube and turning it from black to something almost silver. Kesman, she said. In the bunker. You left him down, but not confirmed. The Black Ops unit confirmed him. He had seen it. The specialized equipment, the purposeful movement toward the downed Alpha. That's what they came for. And the pack. Broken. Without an Alpha and without the Council's protection infrastructure, and the remaining pack members scatter or reintegrate under whatever leadership emerges from the pieces, it won't be what it was. Sonia nodded slowly. She was looking out the window at the city. In the growing light, she looked exactly as old as she was, which was very old indeed. And there was something in her expression that was not quite grief, but was adjacent to it. The expression of someone who had been fighting the same war for so long that victory and continuation were indistinguishable from each other. "What will you do?" Wick said. It was the first personal question he had asked her. "Rebuild," she said simply. "There are death dealers who swore to the old protocols and have been waiting for the Council's authority to collapse. With the estate's records, and with the Council gone, there is an opportunity to establish something less corrupt than what existed before." She paused. "It will take time. Decades, probably. We are patient people by necessity." He thought about that. Decades. The scale of time these things operated on. The wars that ran beneath human civilization across centuries. The patience required to fight at that tempo. "The high table," she said. "When you deliver the files, they will know about us." "They already knew," he said. "The Council told them. The table has known for longer than that, probably." He glanced at her. "They won't move against you. The table operates on the same principle your world does. Covert infrastructure, mutual deterrence, the understanding that exposure benefits no one. They'll want an arrangement. And if I don't want an arrangement with the high table, then don't make one," Wick said. "But they'll ask." He dropped Sonia and the 2 surviving death dealers at a location she specified in the 3rd district, 3 blocks from the safehouse that was no longer a secret but was still standing. She got out of the car and then paused with the door open and looked back at him with those ancient, assessing eyes. "You're an extraordinary thing, Mr. Wick," she said. "In a world full of people who cannot die, you are somehow the most dangerous person in it." He said nothing. She closed the door. He drove to the Continental, walked through the lobby past the staff who had replaced Domonkos pending institutional review, went up to his room, sat on the edge of the bed, and for a long moment simply breathed. Carefully, around the ribs, in the silence of a room that was his and secure and quiet. Then he picked up his phone and began composing the contract completion report to the high table. The contract was completed on a Wednesday, which was as good a day as any to finish what you started. The high table received John Wick's report, the extracted server files, and the formal documentation of the proxy council's fabrications with the institutional silence of an organization that processed inconvenient truths by absorbing them into its operational framework and continuing. And then Domonkos was removed from his position with the finality that Continental Protocol reserved for managers who had burned neutral ground. The Budapest Continental's neutrality was formally reinstated within 72 hours, its walls once again holding the particular sanctity that the criminal world depended on. The high table noted the existence of the supernatural community in their records. Arrangements, as Wick had predicted, were eventually sought. Whether Sonia accepted them was a matter that played out over years rather than days, in the patient, centuries-deep tempo of a world that had been hiding beneath a human one since before nations had borders. In the Buda Hills, the coven rebuilt slowly. The Lycan packs restructured around new leadership with no memory of Vidor Kezman's ambitions. The war that had been running for centuries continued. Quieter now, the particular quiet of combatants who had lost their most aggressive voices and were reassessing the cost of noise. John Wick flew out of Budapest on a Thursday morning, one arm strapped, 3 ribs taped, a leather bag in the overhead rack, and a dark wool coat across his lap. He looked out the window as the city fell away beneath him. The river, the bridges, the hills where things older than history had been fighting their private wars. and thought about nothing in particular. That he had walked into a world that should have killed him. He had walked out of it. That was enough.